Hi, I'm Lindsay Ibbotson, Honorary Research Fellow at the Durham School for Education. And today we're at the Delta Hotel for a conference looking at what makes teaching attractive and worthwhile. Professor Gorard opened the first session with an introduction to the complex determinants of teacher shortages.
One of the issues is there is no national register, and if we made better use of the people who want to be teachers, then we could have more teachers and we could overcome at least some of the shortage, and so on. We've also got issues of incongruent policies. So often governments introduce policies and they don't think, what's going to be the implication of this policy for teacher supply? And obvious things would be like introducing new schools. So we're going to have 50 additional schools, like when they introduced academies or when they introduced free schools. Often these were new schools, so they needed a full complement of teachers. Where are they going to come from? They're going to come from the existing pool of potential teachers, and therefore there are fewer teachers elsewhere. But when the politicians introduce policies like this, opening, closing schools, changing the nature of schools, or restricting the supply, as in the most recent initial teacher education review, then you end up with not enough teachers, even though the policy itself wasn't necessarily about teachers. These factors, we think, may be more important than the often cited things like pay, conditions, workload, pupil behaviour. There's also a lot of methods problems in existing work. And unsurprisingly, teachers say we'd like more pay, we'd like to have less work and so on. Now, I'm not saying teachers shouldn't have more pay or shouldn't have less work. What I'm saying is you're getting a biased view, so that all the policies that are then generated to have more teachers are based on what existing and potential teachers say about teaching. But surely they're not the important group. The important group is the people who could have been teachers, who might have been interested in being teachers, and they've been put off by something.
He then showed delegates an international comparison of teacher shortages, with England being one of the countries listed as having a shortage. Contributory factors included the amount of non-teaching workload, coping with multicultural diversity, and whether teachers were working in towns as opposed to cities.
So it's interesting that areas where most of the schools and most of the people, and therefore most of the students, live in towns, are more likely to have shortage, whereas schools in cities are less likely to have shortages.
The next speaker was Rebecca Morris, with a closer look at the situation in the 4 nations of the UK. For example, Wales reported a sharp shortfall in applications for teacher training and a mismatch between the ethnic diversity in the workforce and that of the student population. In Scotland, though more flexible pathways into teaching have been brought in and a higher starting salary, challenges remain.
This didn't always mean, though, that schools were keeping people on in a permanent way. So often they would recruit someone, have them for a year because they were quite cheap in terms of their salary coming out of their training year, and then they would let them go and replace them with somebody who had also just finished their training.
Professor C then looked at what had emerged through the research as important factors in making teaching attractive and worthwhile.
All the studies, they mentioned well-being, job satisfaction, and self-efficacy, that teachers believe in their own ability.
She then described a model for working in a positive and effectively led environment. After a break, delegates returned to hear Stephen Gorard examine the research on just how much of a mismatch exists between the cultural diversity of the teaching workforce and the student population that it teaches.
But basically, ethnic minority teachers are underrepresented in the English system.
And this effect is compounded if we look just at head teachers.
And of those people who accepted, more of the ethnic minority people do not succeed in their course, and more of them do not get a qualified teacher status post at the end of it, and so on. So you've got a sort of pipeline of attrition of ethnic minority applicants, up to the point where in the northeast, you don't have any ethnic minority head teachers.
Why does this matter?
Some quite good evidence, a lot of it from America. The ethnic proportionality or disproportionality of staff and students is clearly linked to having better relationships between staff and students. Students in schools that have a diversity of teachers are less likely to be diagnosed as having a special need. They're more likely to be entered for gifted programs. They have lower absence, lower dropout, less likely to be reported for behaviour. They're happier and less likely to be excluded or suspended from school. And those seem to be really, really valuable outcomes.
Of course, these alone are not direct measures of the effect on attainment, but Durham is now tackling this very area.
We're going to link individual students to the ethnicity of their teachers through the school workforce census. At the moment, we're in the first week of a national survey of all teachers. So for any teachers here, any head teachers here, any people who are executive leaders of groups and so on, we have a survey. I can send you a link or a QR code. We've been tweeting about it. We've emailed to all head teachers in England, and we've used organisations like Chartered College and some others to send through their Schools North East was another one, and all schools should be receiving this. We've had about 1,200 responses so far in the first week. Some schools were on holiday. We'd like to get thousands of responses, asking people about a range of things to do with their school, their experiences, the reasons they might move school or the reasons they might leave the teaching profession altogether. We think this will be an important national resource that has never been collected before.
In the discussion that followed, questions were asked about the ideal mix of ethnic diversity in schools.
The ideal mix, the mix of the population. That you don't allow residential and occupational segregation to create a mix of schools which is not balanced.
How might that mix be achieved?
You don't have school diversity. We've got over 100, maybe 200 different types of secondary school in England. If you think about age range, VA, VC, specialist, foundation, grammar, there are just so many combinations. Why? It's a national system. Surely you have one kind of school which everybody goes to. You can have different tracks, you could have different pathways, you could have different activities within the school. That's up to the school to decide. But surely you should go to school with the people who are nearby you. What I want to do is to make it not matter which school you go to, wherever in the country.
How do you support equality of opportunity in such a system?
Every child who is eligible for pupil premium brings a wad of cash with them to the school. And since that's happened in 2011, the clustering of disadvantage between schools has plummeted.
After lunch, there was an open discussion with a panel of experts. Dr. Ledger took a question on the challenges of aligning teacher recruitment with demand.
Actually, in most countries, they can get enough teachers. The challenge is getting them at the right moment. And what tends to happen is the population or the demand for teachers increases. The government starts reacting, like maybe 2 years later, maybe for 7 years later in some cases, and start building up the number of teachers, but it's too late. So if we change the way we plan, we could have the two in line with each other without actually recruiting more people, just having them at the correct moment in time.
Dr. Liang Gao talked about the need to use holistic data, integrating both surveys and ministry data to examine the pipeline of teacher supply. She also emphasised the importance of diversity at higher levels.
So I'm especially interested in the underrepresentation of ethnic minority in the leadership, in the management team.
Dr. Hidayat Tok also raised the subject of effective teacher mentoring.
When the probationers, when the beginner teachers get a good mentoring, they remain in their work. I think that the mentor teachers should be trained.
I can talk from experience about mentoring. Absolutely mentoring is needed. We have an excellent example in London during London Challenge period between 2004 and 2010 by introducing extensive mentoring program for a teacher, how school made a huge difference.
From 2024, all mentors of initial teacher education students will have to undergo minimum levels of training. I'm worried that schools will say we've got to make sure our mentors release our mentors for this amount of training. This is very burdensome, especially when we're also having to train the early career teachers, the mentors for the early career teachers. We can't do it even with the money because we can't backfill the staff, we can't find the staff. We're going to withdraw from initial teacher education partnerships. On the workforce planning side of things, the government do set targets for initial teacher education recruitment by secondary subject and for overall for primary. But applications suggest they're going to miss their targets for secondary in 9 out of 17 secondary subjects by 20% or more.
On the subject of diversity, we should not only think of ethnicity.
I want the diversity of all groups, and it includes children from very poor background, children with learning difficulties. They should be equally diversified.
James Noble Rogers summed up by giving us his top 3 priorities for the education system at present.
Would firstly be to make sure that there was a properly regulated and accredited teacher education provider with partner schools available to everyone wherever in the country they live. And as a result of the government's recent market restructuring of teacher education, that is less the case now than it was, or it will be less the case in a year than it currently is now. I would ensure that funding streams make it affordable for people to go to access initial teacher education programs, whether that's through fee loan forgiveness or an evening out of bursaries, to make it doable for people to train to be teachers, because at the moment, especially with fewer ITE providers in existence and schools pulling out of ITE because of external pressures, people have to drive and travel long distances to train. They simply can't afford to, so that needs addressing. And thirdly, allow teacher education providers, albeit within agreed national broad frameworks, to have the autonomy to contextualise the training they offer to reflect the needs of particular local communities.
Yes.
Brilliant.
So what do people make of the day?
So I expressed my idea about teacher retention in terms of the mentoring programs, and so that was very important for me.
It's a case of raising the message and bringing it to the attention of policymakers. That's where the real change happens. And so I think that is very, very important through research like this and through bringing people together. Particularly the USAT executive director was here today. And so I think it kind of connects the message of this huge crisis with recruitment, along with the lack of ethnic minority teachers in the pipeline. So it's all interlinked messages that came out together today.
All the ITE providers I speak to have a commitment to equality and diversity. They wouldn't knowingly discriminate, but there is something going on which needs investigation.
So what's the current status of teacher training?
The majority of the market, despite the best evidence, the best efforts of government in 2011 and in the last 12 months, are university school partnership programs.
So, an interesting day, looking at the challenges in making teaching an attractive career option. Here's a last word from the director of DECI, Stephen Gorard.
So I was really happy. I hope the SSC who funded it or partially funded it will be happy, and we thank them and we thank everybody who came today. If I have one reservation, if I may, it's that this was a public event. I would like to see a wider participation by teachers and parents and so on in the local area. We did have some attendees, but I'd like to see more.